Can I post take questions 1 to 6 together? The National Economic and Social Council, NESC, is an independent statutory agency operating under the aegis of my department. The Council analyses and reports on strategic policy matters relevant to Ireland's economic, social, environmental and sustainable development. In accordance with the National Economic and Social Development Office NESDO Act of 2006, I have certain functions such as appointing the members of the NESC and presenting reports to Government prior to publication. The Council is funded through my department's vote, and my department also has governance responsibilities in relation to the Council. In accordance with the legislation, 2 officials from my department at Secretary-General and Assistant Secretary level currently have the positions of Chairperson and Deputy Chairperson. Since becoming Taoiseach, I've made 8 appointments to the NESC, 5 of these since February 2018. 4 appointments were made on the basis of nominations from sectoral organisations as provided for in the legislation. In addition, 4 independent members were appointed following advertisement of the vacancies on stateboards.ie and a selection process conducted by the Public Appointment Service. The National Economic and Social Development Office is the body corporate for the NESC. Section 13 of the NESDO Act 06 provides that the Chairperson and Deputy Chairperson of the NESC are also members of NESDO. The National Statistics Board was established under the Statistics Act 1993 to guide the broad strategic direction of the Central Statistics Office, in particular to establish priorities for the development of statistics in Ireland. The legislation provides that the NSB shall consist of 8 members, including an Assistant Secretary or equivalent or higher grade from my department and the Department of Finance, and also the Director General of the CSO. I made 1 appointment to the National Statistics Board last month, following a selection process conducted by the Public Appointment Service. All appointments to the NESC and to the NSB have been made in line with the relevant provisions and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform's guidelines and appointments to state boards. Finally, 1 principal officer in my department has been nominated to the Council of Gaisce, whose appointments are made by the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs.
It's odd that my question 6 on NESC was folded into the 5 questions in relation to state boards, but there we are. Can I ask the Taoiseach, just in relation to state boards, have all departmental officials who are on state boards been appraised of Circular 1210, in particular that a minister must be notified without delay where there is a significant strategic or reputational risk to the state body that is not being addressed? Can I ask, is there a clear and uniform understanding of the role of departmental or civil servants on state boards? Can I ask him what he understands by civil servants on state boards serving in a personal capacity? Since I'm sure individual civil servants, maybe I'm wrong, you might correct me, don't apply to the state board system themselves as individuals. Presumably they're appointed by ministers because they have a role within the department structure. Can I ask you, do you agree, Taoiseach, with the conclusions of the Controller and Auditor General when he said that concerns should have been passed on to government ministers, concerns about the National Children's Hospital, if the project, if the concerns weren't being addressed by the board themselves? Do you think that is the correct working methodology for civil servants on state boards, that where there is concerns that they believe are not being addressed on the board, that in accordance with Circular 1210, that the Minister should be directly advised of that matter?
Deputy MacDonald.
Thank you, Count Corla. Taoiseach, you'll be familiar with the public sector trends research carried out by the Institute of Public Administration. In its latest study published in December, it found that the proportion of women on the boards of non-commercial state agencies varies greatly by parent department. The highest proportion of women are represented on traditionally feminised boards with responsibility for areas of social policy such as education, children, youth affairs, although all of those fall shy of gender parity. One of the most disappointing findings, Taoiseach, is that your own department has the lowest proportion of women on non-commercial state boards. And I'd be interested to know, Taoiseach, if that position has changed since the research was published. The report also finds that boards which fall under the remit of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, whose responsibility it is to deliver civil service renewal, have the 4th lowest proportion of women. And that is despite the fact that there is now a higher share of women in professional posts, for example, working as senior economists or policy analysts. And this demonstrates that there's no shortage of women with the necessary education and skill to populate these types of boards. 40% of those on state boards are women, but just 27% of them hold chairperson roles. 11 boards have no female representation at all, and less than half of state boards have reached the minimum 40% target of female representation. And I take no pleasure in noting that you have the worst report card when it comes to women's participation on state boards, Taoiseach. And I believe that sends out a really bad signal to women of all ages inside and outside the public sector. I'm sure you've read the IPA research, Taoiseach, and I'd be interested to hear what action you've taken or intend to take to increase the number of women on boards under the aegis of your own department.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Yeah, just following on from Deputy Howland's questions, Taoiseach. I mean, the debacle around the National Children's Hospital and the obligations of civil servants appointed to the board, raise and what their reporting obligations are, really, requires very considerable further explanation. Not just in that particular instance, because of the particular clauses that Deputy Howland is referring to, but I just find it strange more generally. We had this with public interest directors in the banks, we have it in semi-states, and we even used to have in Dún Laoghaire County Council, I presume this is replicated everywhere, bizarre situations where public representatives would be on boards, and when the issues were being discussed around the agency or semi-state entity that they were appointed to was discussed, they would walk out of the room and say, we have a conflict of interests, right? Now, I don't understand that. What is the point of us putting civil servants, or indeed public representatives, on boards or state agencies if they are not responsible to this House or to, if you like, democratic bodies and have responsibilities reporting and otherwise? What is the point? If you just put them in there and then they're somehow subject to the confidentiality of that, in this case, a project group. I mean, it seems to me just to defeat the purpose of putting them on in the first place. Surely the only point of putting a civil servant on a project board like that, or any other agency or semi-state agency, is that they are there to mind the public interest and to report back if the public interest is adversely affected.
Deputy Joan Burton.
Thank you. Taoiseach, some time ago we discussed the issue of women on boards, and I do understand that you've committed to gradually increasing the numbers of women on boards, particularly, if you might say, in the areas like finance and the areas involving money and so on, and that's all to the good. I wonder how long we're going to have to wait, though, in those particular areas, including with reference to both finance and to your own department. But secondly, Ireland is now a very different country in terms of the last census to what it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. We now have people from diverse backgrounds from all over the world who have made their homes in Ireland and whose children have grown up in Ireland, many of whom, and particularly in our own constituency, are now past the teenage stage, have qualified from college and have achieved very significantly. And yet, notwithstanding the contribution that immigrants into Ireland have made, when we look at the composition of the boards, not only are there relatively few women and even fewer women chairpersons of boards, but ethnic diversity is almost entirely missing. Now, your Minister for Finance the other day was telling me about the new holistic approach of his own department in relation to policy issues, which I welcome. But what I want to know is whether or not you would be conscious as Taoiseach, particularly representing Dublin West, where about 30% of the population is either not born in Ireland or their parents were not born in Ireland. You know ourselves in our secondary schools, huge numbers of young people of a variety of ethnic backgrounds, and yet when it comes to public positions like boards, they see very few people like them who are on boards. What are you going to do to address this?
Martin.
I think the issue of civil servants and state boards hasn't been resolved in the context of National Children's Hospital, and I think the public servant on that board had an obligation to report to his line minister and also to the Minister for Health, and I don't think that has been adequately responded to by government. The circular is clear, as is the opinion of the Controller and Auditor General. And when your predecessor, Deputy Kenny, announced various procedures for making appointments to state boards and changed them a number of years ago, he said they would be reviewed over time in order to check whether they were actually delivering better boards. The early evidence was that the new procedures were confirming that people appointed previously were overwhelmingly being viewed as suitable for reappointment, and that the range of people for applying for appointments was broad, but was uncertain whether there was any improvement in the functioning of boards. Can you tell us, Taoiseach, if you have commissioned any independent research on the operation of state boards and whether they are actively performing the role of supervising the strategic direction of state agencies and protecting the public interest? And this is of particular concern in the context of the National Children's Hospital, because last August the government reappointed in full the board of the National Children's Hospital, and little more than 6 months ago the government expressed full confidence in the board's work. And this was at a point when the government was fully aware of the outcome of the tendering procedure overseen by the board. But then suddenly you, as Taoiseach, and your Minister for Health began calling for heads to roll, and indeed the chairperson was offered up as a sacrifice in order to stop more politically sensitive accountability. Can you tell me, Taoiseach, if you are satisfied with the procedure by which you and the government reappointed the Children's Hospital Board last year, and what review did you conduct on their work before nodding through the reappointment of the chairperson and the board?
Thanks very much. Just in relation to Circular 1210, and I think I may have clarified this last week, but I'm happy to do so again. It has been clarified that the responsibility is to report to the line minister of the department under which the board is established, not the department for which the relevant public servant works. So, for example, if it's a health board, the responsibility is to report to the department of the Minister for Health, and Education Board, Minister of Education, not the department in which you work, which could potentially be finance or Taoiseach or whichever. And also the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board has its own code of governance, which is available on its website, which covers the whole issue of confidentiality and the need for board members to maintain collective confidentiality. In relation to Mr Paul Quinn, again, as I explained to the House last week, he met with the Minister for Public Expenditure and discussed the situation, and I understand that he judged that he had no responsibility or obligation to report to the Minister for Health on the matter of the overrun, as the Chairman of the Board had already done so. In relation to women on state boards, we set a target of making sure that at least 40% of people on state boards were women. That's now been exceeded. It's 41 or 42, I think, now. Last year was the first year during which more than half appointments were female, over 50%. And we're now aiming for a higher target to go well above 40%. And the focus now is particularly on boards where there's gender imbalance. That can happen both ways. You'll see in many of the education, health and social care boards, there is a preponderance of women and very few men. And then on the finance and enterprise boards, you'll see a preponderance of men rather than women. So gender balance should work both ways, and the focus is on evening that out across those different types of boards and going up from 40% towards 50%. I'm also leading an initiative around increasing the participation of women on boards of listed private companies, where less than 20% of the membership are female, less than half then is the case on state boards. And now that we've exceeded our 40% target, I think we're in a strong position to put pressure on the private sector to do much better, and I'm leading that initiative. In terms of my own department, I'm happy to correct the deputies on this. I don't actually appoint most of the members to the NESC. They're generally appointed by what we used to call social partners. So of the appointments that occurred since I've become Taoiseach, 3 were made by me, but on the nomination of farming bodies. All 3 were male, and 1 was made by me, but on the nomination of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and he was male. But of the appointments I've actually made myself, which I discretion over, 3 of the 5 were female, so 60%.